Tonight, I want to introduce Matt Peeples. He's going to be giving a talk called the Archaeological Fakes and Frauds in Arizona and Beyond. He's a professor at ASU. He's an associate professor and also the director of the Center for Archaeology and Society in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at ASU, where he's been since 2015. He previously was a fellow at Archaeology Southwest, and he received his doctorate in anthropology from ASU in 2011. He's received major grants from the National Science Foundation, archaeology program, as well as the Cross-Directorate NSF Resource Implementation for Data-Intensive Research. That's a big sentence. Program. He also serves currently as the current president of the Southwest Symposium Organization. I was saying to Matt at dinner tonight, for somebody who got his doctorate 8 years ago, it's phenomenal how much he's published. He's published a book that came out last year, Connected Communities, Networks, Identity, and Social Change in Ancient Cibola World from University of Arizona Press. He's also published 17 authored and co-authored book chapters in edited volumes, and for me, a phenomenal 26 journal articles, including publishing 3 times in Journal of Archaeological Science, 3 times in the SA Advances Journal, 3 times in American Antiquity, and the list goes on and on. So Matt is going to give a great talk tonight, so let's give him a warm welcome.
So the topic I'm going to talk about today is a little bit different. Most of my research, I do regional scale archaeology research in the Southwest. A lot of my field work has been in the Zuni-Cibola area. And I'm also involved in the Cyber Southwest Social Networks project with Barbara Mills and others at Archaeology Southwest here tonight. And this is a topic that started with an undergraduate class that I decided to create at ASU, and sort of ballooned from there. My interest in this has kind of grown a little bit. But really what happened is I started using a survey that the archaeologist Ken Fader in Connecticut had created to poll students on their belief in certain sorts of topics that we might think of as pseudo-scientific, pseudo-archaeological, and so on. And one thing that he'd noted is that answers students provide for questions like, there's good evidence for existence of the lost continent of Atlantis, there's good evidence that extraterrestrials visited the Earth in the prehistoric past. There's been a reasonable level of agreement with statements like that for a long time, and it hasn't really changed much since the 1970s, with one thing of the belief in extraterrestrials visiting Earth in the prehistoric past increasing through time. That's been one that's increasing. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I think that is. And these are data pulled from one of the times when I taught that class. And you can sort of see, I've listed a couple of example questions, but other things like the Maya predicted the end of the world in 2012 and so on. And the students' beliefs in those topics is relatively stationary since the 1970s, since Ken Fader's been doing that study. So I decided that I was going to focus the class directly on confronting these kinds of ideas, so teaching pseudo-archaeology. And I created a class, and one of my students in my class actually created this banner for the class for me, which I think is great, kind of summarizes some of the topics we're talking about in there. So Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries is the title of the Ken Fader book that I kind of drew inspiration of here. But since teaching this class, the first time it was a little bit experimental. There were 40 students in it in the first time, which is actually quite large. But the class was then listed the next semester for 100 students, and it filled up in a minute and a half or something like that in registration. So now it's a 250-person class. It's ballooned into this massive thing, and I'm very proud that it's always the first one to fill up in our course catalog in anthropology, which I take that as a good sign that we're getting the message out there in those ways. And I think it's important to kind of talk about these topics and not shy away from them, because I think the field as a whole has not really addressed these kinds of questions, and that's why there's so much information kind of filling the void with television and books, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So if we want to talk about what is pseudo-archaeology, we can provide a basic definition of archaeology as the systematic and scientific study of human societies based on material, culture, and context. So it's focused on answering questions about the past. That's kind of one way of thinking about the purview of archaeology generally. So what is pseudo-archaeology that I'm referring to here? And what I refer to there is what I call radical interpretations of archaeological sites, features, and artifacts that are not grounded in the principles of archaeological method nor in context. So people using archaeological objects, places, spaces, and making arguments that aren't tied to the scientific process of evaluating and studying them. And this is big business. Many of you have probably heard of some of these TV shows or books and things like this, like the Chariots of the Gods is probably the most famous of these books that was published in the 60s and 70s in many different languages across the world, and also shows like Ancient Aliens, which was unfortunately renewed for its 15th season this week, just to show you how popular these things are. And these books sell way more than archaeological books that we write, right, as professional archaeologists, right? So this is big business, and this is what a lot of people are reading. And to me, this says that there's an interest in these kinds of topics in the general public that we could potentially harness, and I don't think we necessarily are. And these kinds of arguments and books are kind of filling that void. So to start off, I want to give you a classic example of a pseudo-archaeological interpretation to kind of set the stage for what it is we're talking about. And has anyone ever heard of the helicopter hieroglyph before? Is this one that anybody's ever seen before? So this is a temple which began construction under Seti I, was completed by his son Ramesses II. And you can see the inscription here. People have interpreted that upper left figure to represent a helicopter. It looks kind of like an Apache helicopter or something like that. Maybe you have a tank to the right, a little UFO, kind of sci-fi looking UFO below that, and then an airplane or glider down below the bottom. And there's been a lot made by this about this in certain corners of the internet. That this is proof that ancient Egyptians had contact with alien presence and they were given technologies by aliens in the past. But we actually know the context of this writing, and what we know is this is actually the name of Seti I overlain by the name of Ramesses II. They started carving one name, covered it in plaster, carved the second name on top, and it's the amalgam is what those interesting shapes they're kind of making those interpretations of. So this is like a classic example that to make that helicopter interpretation and then take it further to suggest that this suggests alien contact or future knowledge and so on. You have to basically ignore everything about the context that we know of this and where this is found. So that's kind of a classic pseudo-archaeological interpretation. So as I've kind of gotten into this a little bit more and done a little bit more reading, and I've read, I've fallen into the kind of weird corners of the internet, tracking some of these things down. I've decided to kind of define a few what I call flavors of pseudo-archaeology that are common out there. What are the common kinds of arguments you see again and again in these kinds of contexts? And probably the most common is one everyone's heard of, ideas about lost continents and lost civilizations. Atlantis and Mu are the two most famous, the lesser-known Lemuria for people that are really digging deep into these. But these are ideas that there's a lost continent somewhere on the world that's currently underwater that was a source of early civilization that disappeared in a cataclysm, and they were the source and origin of all civilization throughout the world. And this is often tied to ancient Egypt in various ways, and so on. And these ideas really gained popularity in the 19th century, but they're quite old. These ideas go back quite far, and I can talk a little bit more about that later. The next is, of course, the Ancient Aliens, which has been popularized by the TV show of the same name recently, or Chariots of the Gods by Eric von Däniken in the 1960s and 70s. And this is the idea that there's evidence of extraterrestrial visitation among populations throughout the world, and they were responsible for the development of culture and technology throughout various parts of the world. And this is in many ways tied to Atlantis, because a lot of times the same arguments are used, essentially replacing aliens where Atlanteans once were, and the same arguments in the 19th century. So there's kind of some interesting cross-pollination in that way. These are just many objects that have been argued to suggest, people were depicting astronauts in these figurines of ball players and so on from various parts of the world. Another flavor is what I call the "who built this" arguments, and this is sort of in a lot of colonial context. This is where indigenous people in various parts of the world have built massive, constructions, impressive constructions, and colonial populations later come in and question whether those people could have built that. So examples like Great Zimbabwe, it was actually illegal to say that was built by local people at one point in the past, and so on. And things like Tiwanaku and then Cahokia. I'll talk a little bit more about the mounds here. Those of all things that were created by indigenous populations, but later questioned as, they certainly couldn't have built that. They don't have the technology to have built that, and so on. Another one that surprised me, how common this is stories about giants. Some of these are tied to biblical stories. I think that's maybe why they're so popular. But there's actually sort of what Andy White, in a blog that he does about these kinds of topics, is called a giant craze in the mid-19th century, where there's actually just hundreds of newspaper articles about supposed remains of giants being recovered in various parts of the Midwest, then the kind of West, of Americans thinking, looking west, and so on. And this often gets tied into interesting things like Bigfoot and so on. But this is actually, it deserves its own kind of subtopic of how common this actually is, these arguments about giants. And often the Smithsonian is blamed for hiding the skeletons. This is why we don't know about these anymore. Another kind of more troubling flavor, the kind of nationalist and racist archaeology and how archaeology has been misused. One prime example of this is that the Nazi Party in the 1930s and 40s used archaeology to justify geopolitical moves, for example. They conducted excavations in Czechoslovakia to show the Germanness of people living there to justify their taking of that land and so on. So they're using archaeology as a political tool. And that's very common, actually. And this is sort of a common example. And they were also using things like the swastika symbol that's very common in many parts of the world and suggesting that that was this evidence of this widespread Aryan race across the world. And they had all kinds of interesting ideas about the hollow earth and so on, which we could go into more if people are interested. And then the last kind of unfortunate flavor is what we would think of as scientific frauds. These are the fakes, the things people make and fabricate for fame, for money, for attention, whatever it is. This is Fujimura, a Japanese archaeologist, who had provided the earliest evidence, what was thought of as the earliest evidence of occupation in Japan. Actually had a stamp of the find that he'd made there. But some of the researchers that worked with him were suspicious because the finds only took place when he was there. He was always present and the one making the find specifically. So a group of reporters actually filmed him, and he was planting artifacts on the site before going out and actually recovering those and taking them out there. So that's an unfortunate example of someone actually faking the archaeological record, and that can do a lot of damage to the archaeological record. So if we think about this, what motivates these things? I have two kind of subsets here. I think of the more nefarious motives, things like money, fame, racism, nationalism, political agendas, and so on, I've kind of mentioned. And the second is what I call our weird brains. These are phenomena like our cognitive biases, pareidolia, our desire for a romantic past, the power of belief, and so on. We're really good at making patterns out of random noise. And I think a lot of these things are people in good faith making arguments about evidence they don't fully understand because they don't understand the context and so on. But if you start digging around for ideas like this on the internet, you see all these things about suppression, the hidden history of the past. Archaeologists are suppressing this, the scientific community is suppressing this, and so on. So it's interesting that is the narrative that's out there. The narrative is out there is that we archaeologists are here to keep people from making these radical interpretations of the past because we want, to sell more textbooks or something. It's never really clear exactly what the outcomes are. To keep the status quo is often a statement you see presented here. And this is something, we think of this as kind of a marginal topic, but as I said, if you look at the sales of books on these kinds of topics, it's much higher than the sales of books on traditional archaeological topics, what we would think of as scientific archaeological topics. So there is a mass consumption of these kinds of ideas out there. And a lot of these, I would argue, can be quite harmful. They're not sort of benign. So some of the students that were in my class, the first time I taught this, were questioning, well, isn't this just kind of, all good fun? It's just sort of a fun idea and so on. But I think a lot of this does a lot of real damage to both the archaeological record and also people's interpretations of their own history and other people's history as well. And one example I kind of like to provide in the context of American history, how this is played out. So in the 18th and 19th century, there was an idea out there by people, Americans, people that were pushing west. Settling west was, Ohio at the time. We're talking about areas not super far away from the East Coast and so on. But they're encountering these massive earthen mounds, things like Cahokia, the Ohio Hopewell Mounds, Serpent Mound, and so on. They're encountering these massive earthworks and trying to understand who had built them. And their assumptions ranged pretty widely, but there was a general consensus among most people at the time that they could not have been built by Native American people living in the area at the time, because they weren't currently building mounds at the time. That, of course, is not even true, because there were contemporary groups in Florida and other places in the South that were building mounds even at this time. But this was a really popular idea. And to fill the void of who was building this, you see, innumerable different interpretations of who could have been responsible for this. Everyone but the native populations of these areas. You see examples of the Chinese, the Welsh, the Greeks, the Vikings, Polynesians, people from all different parts of the world have been, argued in print in these popular books and articles to have been the people that had constructed these mounds, and therefore the Native American populations had taken the land from their original constructors. Therefore, us taking their land is only just. That was the argument that was being made in public at the time. And this was directly tied to a lot of political actions. So this idea was really popular at the time, and especially in the beginning of the 19th century. And it's interesting, you can read the congressional record from the 1830s. You can read speeches by Andrew Jackson. He's talking about this mound builder idea. He's talking about the original inhabitants of this continent were taken away by this Native American population, so it's only just that we do this. This is the terms that they're using at the time. And things like the Indian Relocation Act of 1830 were justified using these kinds of ideas. And a lot of this was tied to a lot of prominent hoaxes that were happening around the same time. So, for example, you see these stones on the left. The top left is what's called the Grave Creek Stone, the Bat Creek Stone to the right, and then the Newark Holy Stones, were these stones that were supposedly recovered from mound sites in Ohio and other places in West Virginia and in Tennessee that had text on them that was in an ancient Hebrew script, suggesting that the original inhabitants had been, part of this Judeo-Christian, Jewish population, and therefore it's only right that we as Christian Americans take this land back from the Native Americans who had taken it from our ancestors who built it. These are the kinds of justifications that were being offered from this. And these stones were very clear forgeries, even at the time, had been understood that, we have the text that these were copied from in contemporary books, for example, including typos and all, and so on. So, I wanted to show that these aren't kind of ideas without any consequences, right? These things can do real harm, and they were used to justify things like this in the U.S. And actually, I mentioned the Great Zimbabwe example. That example of, in Rhodesia, when things were quite bad, it was illegal to actually say that local populations could have built that, and that was used to justify all kinds of colonial actions. So these things do have real consequences. So next, since we're in Tucson, I want to turn to something that many of you probably have heard of in this area. Who's heard of the Silver Bell artifacts, the Tucson artifacts? A few of you, not that many. So everything I'm going to say in the next little bit comes from a wonderful article by Don Burgess, Romans in Tucson, the story of an archaeological hoax, published in the Journal of the Southwest. So this is about a series of archaeological objects, or purported archaeological objects, that were recovered in the early 1920s up in Silver Bell Road, kind of northwest Tucson. And they seem to show a Roman Jewish presence dated to about 800 in the Tucson area. And they included things like these lead crosses you can see here. And these objects were first noticed or brought to the public attention by a man named Charles Manier, who had found this supposedly while getting out to take a break from driving with his family, noticed something poking out and then pulled it out. And then later, a man, Thomas Bent, homesteaded that area so that he could dig this. And this was happening in the early 1920s, right in the wake of things like Tutankhamun's tomb being excavated in Egypt and so on. And you could see these New York Times, and London Times newspaper stories about Tutankhamun. And it's actually sort of interesting that stories about Tutankhamun were sort of, the specific photographs and specific aspects of the story were exclusively given to different publications. So there's a lot of other publications that couldn't write about these things. And you see an uptick in other kinds of archaeological ideas because the public sort of had a hunger for that at the time. So this is happening at that time when the public is really hungry for sort of archaeological ideas that are sort of these grand things and these amazing artifacts and so on. So here's a close-up of one of the objects. You can see it has lead objects that are carved with sort of lightly engraved drawings of people, names, text in Latin and Hebrew, and so on. Many of these objects are quite large and were sort of mounted in multiple pieces with kind of composite construction. and so on. Looking at these now, there's a lot of aspects of these that shout out to us that we should investigate this further before we take this at face value. But at the time, a lot of people were taking this at face value. It was sort of a popular idea that these were real and that this was going to be, this big discovery that's going to put the archaeology of this area on a map in a new way. You can see many of the objects when they were recovered. This is something like a 60-pound lead cross. So exactly what is that, and what would that be useful for in any way? Thinking about these large, heavy objects and so on. We have things like spear points and so on. And one of the things that was noticed, you can see the impression and the caliche of that object right there that's just been removed. And some of the archaeologists that were working in this project from the very beginning were quite suspicious of what they were finding, not just because it was unexpected, but because the way these things seemed to be found in the archaeological record didn't seem to jive with what they knew. So Emil Howry, who many of you probably know of, very famous archaeologist, worked on this project when he was a student and actually noticed that he pedestaled one of these objects, picked it up without ever touching the bottom, and it had striations in a horizontal way showing it to be jammed into the place where he'd found it. And that to him was kind of, this coffin nail that these things couldn't be real. But beyond that, these things really are quite fantastical. Like one of them actually has a dinosaur on it, which is very similar to this drawing of a Diplodocus from the time period when we had a very different concept of the anatomy of that dinosaur. So it's a 1920s understanding of the anatomy and physiology of a dinosaur represented in this, which is strong evidence, I would say, of this is a local, period creation. At the same time, this was interesting enough to Byron Cummings at Arizona State Museum that he actually conducted excavations there. And actually, for a time, the University of Arizona was considering buying the site and actually purchasing the objects and the site and so on for $10,000 in the 1920s, which was a fair sum of money at the time. They were eventually convinced that the objects couldn't be real, and it sort of quietly went to the side. And for the details of that story, I'd all suggest to you, if you're interested, to look at that Don Burgess article, because it's great and goes into a lot of detail. But at the same time, even after the scientists had sort of changed their mind largely on this, you get these ping-ponging news stories between New York Times and Arizona Daily Star and so on. These things, the common phrase, I have a Google alert for X baffles scientists, because that's a great way of finding stories like this. What's baffling scientists this day. But you can see, excavations kept secret by the discoverers of the relics. Front page of the New York Times. This was a big story at the time, and it's really going back and forth at the time. And at the same time, we get opponents of this idea publishing at the same time. So this is 1926. A Latin professor here at the University of Arizona had actually said that all of the text found within these is found in one common textbook that was available at the time, including, again, some typos that were found in the textbook as well as on the objects, with just names and things like that being changed. So overall, the evidence is that the geologic layers that the artifacts were in date from 10,000 BC to 2 million years ago. So first of all, not dating anywhere close to the 800 AD suggested. The metal casting methods and materials used in this were not invented into the 1800s, so that's another slam dunk that these have to be modern forgeries. The documented artifact discoveries occurred at the margins of trenches, making for easy contacts to plant artifacts below the surface. And the Latin inscriptions on the artifacts are, except for a few alterations with typos, copies of text from a Latin textbook that was widely used at the time. So the question is, who did this, right? It's a whodunit. Was it the people that originally brought this to the public's attention? Don Burgess goes through, and I'll give you, leave it to read his article, all the different scenarios. He suggests it's probably someone that was involved in the excavations. I also think it's interesting that there was a Mexican man who lived near the lime kiln at the time who was a sculptor that was known to have a large collection of Latin and Hebrew textbooks as well. So he's another likely category. So, this is an example where, in the 1920s, there was already a slam dunk case against this, right? We have a lot of counter evidence to this. But in 2016, there's still articles being published suggesting that these finds are real, and that everything that I've just told you is just this cover-up. We're all part of the covering up the truth about these objects. So this is, things like this is why I want to delve into these things in a little bit more in depth in a class. It's because, even in light of all that evidence, people are still believing these ideas because they suit, some other idea that they have well, and so on. And it's sort of hard to know, the profile of people that believe these things, but In 2013, there was a public policy polling study that polled people along a range of conspiratorial ideas, things like the moon landing was faked, Paul McCartney died in 1966, political elites are lizard people, and so on. And what this, and I've got some of the more fantastical ones here, but all the way to things like 51% believe that JFK assassination involved a conspiracy. That's worded in such a way that, there's some give in what people maybe mean by that. But what the study found is at least 55% of people believed in at least one conspiracy theory. And the best predictor of believing in conspiracy theories was believing in other conspiracy theories. So there's people that are sort of clustering around sets of beliefs. It's not, nobody believes all of them, but people believe sets kind of together, that hang together, probably because those sets of things confirm, other things, the way they feel about the government or the way their religious beliefs and so on. So, this suggests that these kinds of weird things are widely believed. So why is that? And one of the things that psychologists that study these kinds of issues have brought out is our brains are kind of pattern making machines in a lot of ways, and we're very good at finding the pattern and even random noise. And a great visual example of that is pareidolia. Our ability to make faces out of inanimate objects like, that angry purse or that poor concrete block there, and so on. Grilled cheese sandwiches and tortillas and any kind of fried thing like that are prime candidates for this kind of thing. And, you can quite clearly see these faces, right? Your brain is making patterns out of this random noise. Just type pareidolia into Google image search and just, have fun with all the fun things that are there. And this drives a lot of these popular interpretations, I think. And one famous example that maybe some people are familiar with, have people seen this before, the face on Mars? This was kind of a famous thing. So the Viking 1 in 1976 took a picture of the Cydonia region of Mars that depicted this supposed face in the center right there. So this was something that was actually found by a NASA researcher who was looking through the photos and identified this, and then he subsequently identified all these other structures this NASA scientist suggested were human-constructed buildings, and so on. So in 1999, a journalist and author, Graham Hancock, who's one of the major purveyors of these kinds of ideas, wrote this book called The Mars Mystery, and he argues that the Mars face is there to draw our attention to the planet when we reach a certain level of development. And he was drawing parallels between the face he saw on Mars and other sort of structures he was interpreting as pyramids or mastabas and tombs like Egyptian, and linking that back to Egyptian culture. So it's again part of that broader pattern of tying ancient Egyptian culture to these lost civilizations or aliens, as it may well be. So note the publication of that book in 1999. So in 1998, because of all the hubbub that had come up over this, NASA actually had an opportunity and used the opportunity to rephotograph that face on Mars with a much higher resolution camera that didn't have the kind of pixel artifacts that were present there. And this is the image they returned. Again, this was a year before the book came out. And you can see there, you can see the erosional features. They're kind of unusual because they're taking place in a very different environment in terms of atmosphere and so on. Yet, this doesn't look much like a face when you have a high-resolution image of it. We've got pictures in 1998 before the book comes out in 2001, and again, and the short answer is it didn't help, unfortunately. There's still a lot of corners of the internet where you will find this and say that the second photo was faked, or they can still make out a face in the second photo and so on. So, one of the things that archaeologists and others that are interested in these kind of ideas have done is we now have great imagery of a lot of Mars, and it's actually quite easy to look at. So you can find all kinds of things on Mars, like smiley face, a mammoth, mastodon, maybe elephant. And this is my favorite, is Kermit the Frog, found on Mars. So, our brains are really good at making patterns out of this random noise of, these low pixel count images from Mars and so on. And you can see the same sorts of things, people using Google Earth to find all kinds of things and test their pet theories. Now I'm going to turn to an example that's a little bit more local to an area here, what's often been called the Utah pterosaur. This is a big rock art panel. In 1970, the archaeologist Polly Shaftsma identified it as a bird. You can sort of see the white outline is actually chalk that was drawn recently by people that were going to visit this. So don't think of that as part of the actual original image. In 1979, a geologist named Francis Barnes claims it looked like a pterosaur, and that's been used by many others to argue that humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time. And this has gone as far as people claiming that this is Quetzalcoatlus northerpi, so like a specific species of pterosaur. It's not a dinosaur. My son would be angry if I said that. But it's reptilian creature that lived in the same period as the dinosaurs, we'll say. But this pterosaur image, you can sort of see how people make that interpretation. Maybe it looks like kind of a water bird or something like that. In 2015, people went back out and photographed this and did X-ray fluorescence on this panel and found, using things like D-stretch and other sorts of image processing, that it's actually a series of images that have sort of blended together by weathering. The water washing over this rock shelter over the years has kind of blended all these things together into one color tone together on the surface. But we can clearly see that this is actually a series of images near each other that have been misinterpreted in this way. Yet, again, these are still ideas that are out there, and this has been this is evidence that's been presented, to put forward creationist narratives of the origin of human populations and so on. So we think about what kind of confirmation bias, cognitive biases are driving these ideas, and one that psychologists talk a lot about is the idea of confirmation biases, and this is the tendency for people to more readily believe and seek out information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs. So you've got the circle of objective, factual information. You've got things you believe. Where those overlap, you put a lot more stock in that than where they don't overlap. And this is something that's often true. And this, I think, takes the form of people come up with a pet idea or theory and then go looking for things that fit that, ignoring everything else that doesn't. This is the sort of cherry-picking idea. And so an example of this would be, there's a lot of ink that's been spilled over something called the Orion mystery, or the notion that the Egyptian pyramids and many other monuments in ancient Egypt may have been depicting Orion and other constellations, and very specifically on the ground. And so, for example, Robert Bauval and others wrote a book where they were arguing that the three Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau represent the three stars in the belt of Orion, two in line, one slightly offset and smaller. And you can actually notice that they actually reversed imaged and flipped this in the way they printed it in the book to make it line up. They're actually in reverse, mirror image, in reality versus this. And based on this, they took this further, suggesting, maybe there's something to that interpretation. We don't have any evidence that Egyptians in the period that these structures were built had the specific constellations that were the Mesopotamian constellations, were more like Ptolemaic period Egypt and so on, so that they're not even contemporary in that way. But maybe there's something to that part. But they take it so much further by saying the Sphinx represents the constellation Leo and the Nile is the Milky Way and so on. And they print these pictures in their books, which are actually distorting both the night sky and the orientation of these figures to make things fit their pet idea, right? They're modifying this. And two astronomers tested the ideas and the supposed, specific calculations that Bauval and others were using to say that these aligned with a particular period in time, 10 to 12,000 years ago. So they're suggesting that that's evidence that the pyramids were built much earlier than is accepted by archaeologists. And astronomers have tested this, and their calculations were off by 12 degrees in some cases, so quite far when you're talking about these kinds of arguments and so on. Yet these ideas remain popular. And one that sort of astounded me that was picked up by the Ancient Alien show on the History Channel is they actually suggested that the Hopi Mesas are Orion's belt, and many other sites around the area are other stars in the constellation Orion. So that's suggesting a number of things. That's suggesting that Hopi recognized Orion as a constellation in that way, and that they'd place their sites specifically in those locations to do that. And you can see, astoundingly, it's national parks and state parks that form all the major stars on the outside of these things. Places like Batatacan, Canyon de Chelly, First, Second, and Third Mesa, Wapatki, Walnut Canyon, Hamalavi. Of course, that's ignoring all the other sites in this area, right? So, the question I have is, when you have 50,000 plus sites in northern Arizona, is it really surprising that we can find an alignment like this? Especially if you're tweaking and moving, you can actually see that they actually flip Orion upside down, and there's been arguments for other constellations and so on, but they're taking this argument quite far. So the question is this surprising? So one way I kind of thought about this a little bit more is, what's something that's common that I could get an easy map of? So I did this with Walgreens and Starbucks. And this is Tempe, where I live. And I made an Orion belt of Walgreens. It's quite easy to do. You can do the same thing with Starbucks. You can do the same thing with CVS. Anything that's relatively common. in these roads, you can find, all you need is two things in line and one thing slightly offset from that line, and so on. So this shows the power of confirmation bias, right? If you have the idea that this is true, you go look for anything that confirms that, and you ignore anything that suggests it's unlikely, and so on. So since being at ASU, I've been involved with the Center for Archaeology and Society out at Deer Valley Petroglyph Preserve, which is a large rock art site in the Western Valley, in the Glendale area, in the West Valley of Phoenix area. And going out there, I kept getting a question that I didn't know the origins of. It took me a little while to dig into this, but people would come and they would ask us this question: can you take us to the ship petroglyph? They would ask that. And we didn't know what this was. We were unaware of this at the time. We later found out that the image in the top left was published in a book by a woman, Gloria Farley, suggesting that there is a boat and ship with Punic letters, South Iberian Punic letters, inscriptions to the left, saying the ship, that is presented on a rock in Deer Valley Petroglyph Preserve in the Hedgepeth Hills in Arizona. And the quote from the book goes on to say she had this epigrapher, who's actually a well-known kind of purveyor of these kinds of ideas, named Barry Fell, read this and suggested it said the ship. And there's a lot of special pleading in that, because they're suggesting a language that didn't have vowel removal, had vowel removal using this script and so on. So there's a lot of kind of problems with that. But also it goes on to criticize the archaeologists, saying they'd carelessly covered this in cement, obviously to destroy any evidence of this, and so on. So the first time I taught this class, I had as a project for some of the honor students who were in that class, I said, let's track down what we can about this. Let's go see if we can figure out what's going on with this. So we actually went through the original records of Deer Valley, and then we went out to the site and actually looked to see if we could find anything that looked like this, and then what we could make of it. And we found what probably inspired this. You can see the drawing, the original archaeological drawing on the right, and then a photograph of the same object on the left. And if you look closely at that, you can see there's a lot of differences between the drawing that was published as the ship and the actual rock. So for example, the supposed waves and water don't actually extend under the boat, and it has a long line going down below that. The sail doesn't have the sort of mast and shape that it's given there, and the supposed letters are not nearly as well shaped as they're depicted there. So we took this even a little bit further, and one of the students even looked at like how you would write the ship in the supposed script that's used, and it has very little to do with the script shown here, unless you actually reverse some of the letters and so on. So it's again, this faulty interpretation has been out there. We as archaeologists were completely unaware of it, even though we work at and manage this site. Yet we have members of the general public that are reading this elsewhere and coming there because they've heard about this. That's why they're coming there. So really the question is like, how do we address these people when they come? How can we have them leave with a better sense of what's actually going on, and not just thinking we're covering up the story and so on? And it's a hard question. I don't have the answers to that yet, but we can kind of speculate about that a little bit more. But the last example I want to use here is kind of a fun example. There's a show that used to be on the H2 channel by the History Channel, now on the Travel Channel, called America Unearthed. Have people heard of this one before? By this guy, Scott Walter, who calls himself a forensic geologist. He recently had an episode about Vikings in the desert in Arizona, which I haven't seen yet. But this is one from a few years ago about Anglo-Saxons in Arizona in the 1100s and 1200s. So I'm going to you might think, people are taking something that's maybe got a little grain of truth to it and maybe stretching their interpretations and so on. We're going to see just how deep this goes. So I'm going to play you a clip, a short 7-minute clip of this, and then we're going to kind of dissect what's going on and how this is being presented on a cable channel that's purportedly about history, right? So let's take a look.
Oh, look at that. Wow, those are rooms, all right. Wow. That is a Christian-style cross for sure. And these sure look like runes. That's an R. Not sure what that is. That looks like an S. So I'm not sure. Those don't look like Scandinavian runes. It might be Anglo-Saxon, but you know what? I have an idea. I know a guy who knows something about runes. He knows a lot about runes. I'll send a picture to Mike. weathering is key, obviously, and that's what I'm trying to get a sense of. You know, they look kind of fresh to me. I mean, this spalling here, I don't see any weathering of that. If this was exposed for a long time and the calcite was deposited on this open surface, you know, that process should continue and you'd probably see it there. Well, that's cool, but let's see what else is here. Do you see this?
What's that?
Steve,
Break
you see
along the
this
wall?
here? Right here? It's over on the other side, too. Look at this. See these rock fragments here? And the water was running down here, and it was dissolving out the limestone, and it looks like it cemented these rock fragments here. And it connects over there. There was material here.
It does look like this has been dug out, and that boulder didn't move. You know,
That
maybe
makes-
that's why in '84 they didn't see it. If this was still covered up, and then somebody's come
Somebody
back
dug
and
this out?
dug it out since then.
It was uncovered. That could explain why there's no
Yeah.
weathering. I have something to tell you. I've been sitting on this all morning. I got a translation from Mike. And I wanted to wait till I got up here so I could see it and read it and so we could do this together. I'm going to read this to you, but the other thing that he did say is we know for sure that it's 12th century English. So we've got that for sure. But here we go. Line 1, the body. In parentheses, he has in contrast with the soul, Fitz lays rough Hurrick here. Yeah. He enjoyed, in parentheses, entertainment, joy, merriment, maybe means a good life. The secret stolen at the end of this line. Rough Hurrick's body, fame and glory. Dust beyond Eden, Eden's temple. There's a name here. This
Sounds like a memorial.
This is absolutely a memorial. And then, of course, we have the Christian cross here. I don't know what else it could be.
Well, yeah.
Guys, I got an email from Mike. Guess what? Hurrick's surname, he found it in England. How about that?
Incredible.
Wow. I guess I'm going to the UK. So let me ask you this. What have you learned about our friend, Mr. Rough Hurrick?
I've been doing some investigation at the County Records Office, and I've found some information out about a Peter Hurek. There's more information to come, and the lady at the office said she'd get back to me by 4 this afternoon.
You know, Alan, it's incredible. We've got this name Hurrick on a boulder in a cave in Arizona in the U.S., and it brings us back here to the UK. It's amazing.
It's amazing, but not as amazing as what I'm going to show you now. Just come with me.
Wow. Now I see why you and Mike wanted me to see this. This is reminiscent of what we saw at the Gila cliff dwellings in New Mexico. Incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, look at how it's carved out, beautiful, these rooms. You know, we know we have Rough Hurrick, or Peter Hurrick, if that's who it is, carved on a stone in New Mexico. Dates to about the 1200s. This goes back at least that far, or do we know for sure?
At least, we think at least 1500, but it's quite likely that there were people here before that.
Well, okay, so now what I'm thinking is this architecture that looks so much like what we saw in New Mexico, did Hurrick bring it over there and educate the natives, or did somebody come back, he's still there, and, you know, bring it here?
I guess we'll never know, but the one thing we can be sure about is the contemporary nature, you know, of the timing. It's hardly likely to be a coincidence.
No, there's too many coincidences for this to be a coincidence.
And some...
Alan, those cave dwellings were amazing. And you know what I think probably happened there? I mean, you've got these beautiful sandstone bluffs that were there at one time, and when people first came, they probably were hollowed out a little bit, and they just took advantage and dug them out even more. The architecture is very similar to what I saw at the Gila dwellings. But the one thing that's troubling me here is, you know, they talk about at least 1500s for this site. They have to be older than that.
I don't think, Scott, that there's any doubt about it whatsoever. And I would be stunned if those rock dwellings were not much older.
Oh, I'm certain that they are. Okay.
We've got a text coming in. I wonder if it's... Oh, yes, it's from the Staffordshire Records Office. Hi, Alan. I'm afraid I couldn't find any records for the Herrick family after around 1200.
After 1200. Actually, not finding that name in the records supports what we saw in Arizona. He would be the one to carry on the name, but if he never came back, which appears to be the case based on the memorial, that's why the name died out.
The name disappears.
That's consistent with our story. That makes sense that this actually did happen.
Yes, because it would have died where he died, and of course it could never have appeared in the records again.
Okay, well, let's take a look at what we have here. We've got a surname, Herrick, both carved on a boulder in Arizona and here. And we've got a runic inscription carved in Anglo-Saxon runes in a cave down there, and certainly this is where they were used at this time. I mean, it seems to me we have a very compelling case that's coming together here. This man came over to America prior to Christopher Columbus. And this would just be another example of the many examples that I'm aware of cultures coming to North America prior to 1492.
And I have to say, as a historian, having looked at this closely, for my money, on a balance of probabilities, I think we're talking about the man who came from here, who probably sat in this very manor house we're sitting in now, and who ended up all those miles away. And for that reason alone, I think we ought to propose a toast to Peter.
To Peter.
Are we convinced? So, you think that deserves 3 series on the History Channel and Travel Channel? Just recently got renewed and picked up by the Travel Channel. This is, you know, you probably noticed the other statements he's making about this being one of many examples of people prior to Christopher Columbus coming over from Europe. There are real examples, of course, like the Viking settlements in the northeast of Canada. But, you know, this is sort of his agenda, right? He has this sort of Templar interpretation of the New World and go on. This is one other thing that he's pushing. So the claims that are made there are that we've got these runes and they're authentic. So the questions they have is, why weren't they mentioned by the archaeologist that recorded that site in 1884? He suggested they were not weathered, but they were buried, you know, by that material that had covered that area, and that's why they weren't seen. So the second claim is that Mike, an unnamed expert, translated the text to read about the story of a rough Herrick in the 12th century Anglo-Saxon. And then finally, they make the truly ridiculous claim about the similarities between the Gila cliff dwellings and the cave in the Niver cave dwellings in England. So to dig into this a little bit further, to convince a family member of the lack of credibility of this, a friend of mine, Will Russell, actually went out there and found this cave to identify this rock, and did find the rock that was there. So the original idea was that the runes are authentic but were buried. He took pictures of this, and you can clearly see how fresh those cuts are in his photos. And actually, indeed, above the area that supposedly contained the material that buried those runes, you see additional runes using similar words that actually overlap on top of real pre-contact era petroglyphs. So unfortunately, there's been damage done in the process of creating these petroglyphs there. So right away, you know, we can throw out that interpretation that these look so new because they were buried and so on. You know, there's other things on the walls of the cave that look just as new. And in fact, they cross-cut across existing petroglyphs that were documented by archaeologists in 1984 without documenting the ones that cross-cut them, and so on. So right away, you know, we can say, well, maybe he got duped by, you know, some clever fraud that someone had placed in this area. But I want to show you just how far he's going into nonsense in the show. So he gets a translation from Mike. I'll talk about that briefly in a minute. says, the body lays rough here, he enjoyed a good life, the secret stolen, dust beyond Eden, Eden's temple. Ooh. Sounds really sort of mystical and so on. There's no information provided on the translation. The translation includes several repeated words, the name Rough-Huric and also the word Eden. There's actually no repeated words in this text. If you know anything about runes, those are essentially letters. So, there's a lot more text than could be fit into the short statement here right away. Are these even Anglo-Saxon runes? They're not. I found on the internet, digging around a little bit, a Swedish epigrapher, Heinrich Williams, at Uppsala University, had actually seen this example and actually dug into it further. He said, these are not Anglo-Saxon runes, but they're a reconstructed version of something called Elder Futhark. Translation is completely inconsistent, he says. His new translation is Kalis Astudens Paisha Runans Pashka Ast Mein Eimens. That's the new translation of that. And he's saying it's in a reconstructed version of a language that never actually perhaps existed, called Old Sudovan. So this is sort of something created by a modern kind of, what would you say, a modern hobbyist linguist, reconstructing what a language may have been like in the past. So this Old Baltic, Old Sudovan language script. So once he found a dictionary online created by someone that had been a believer in this translation, the Sudovan translation. They found the real translation of what it says there is, hello, I, the Sudovan, write runes, Pashka is my name. And so, nothing is ever really gone from the internet, so you can go back and find this website on something called the Time Machine, Internet Time Machine, on the archive. If people have ever done that before, you can look at old versions of websites. This website is down, but you can find an old version of the website that delivers this information about the so-called Old Sudovan script. You can see, Kalis, one of the words that was in the text there, hello. You can see down here at the bottom, the credit, Pashka. Pashka is my name. Joseph Pashka lived 5 minutes from the Mustang Mountain Cave in the 1980s and 1990s. Therefore, our likely candidate for our inscriber there, I would say. So, this is how far into the territory of just junk this show is going, right? They're ignoring all this information. They're completely fabricating a translation. They're in no way is this a good faith effort to do anything, right? They're just basically lying on television here. Then they make this ridiculous claim about the cliff dwellings in New Mexico, not even really all that close to Sierra Vista where the Mustang Mountains are. They're suggesting these are similar. They're actually, much older in the Southwest. I don't need to go into all the reasons why this is ridiculous. I think you all know. But you can see the way they talk about it. They're saying, I think they're contemporaneous. We think at least the 1500s, they have to be older. I don't think there's any doubt about it. They just decide that it's older and decide that they're contemporaneous because that feels good or that fits their preconceived notion. Actually, the real dates are the 1770s. They're actually much later than anything anybody's recommending here. So this really just shows how deep into the pit of just, nonsense shows like this are going. And it's not people in good faith making interpretations that are maybe a little wacky or beyond the pale. They're just lying. They're lying using just false information, false translations. I don't know who Mike, the translator, is, but there's a name in the credits for a Mike. I looked him up, and in Minnesota, where Walter is from, there's a guy with the same name whose Facebook page has runes behind it, and he's a guitar teacher in Minnesota. So I think that's likely our translator, Mike. So, what do we do about all this? And I think, one thing you can see is there's a lot of TV shows that have done things like metal detecting and things like that. People are going up and digging up and selling things from archaeological sites. And there's shows and programming promoting these kinds of pseudo-archaeological ideas, and there's things kind of in between. The archaeological community has responded a lot to those kinds of diggers shows and so on, but relatively little to these others. The SAA wrote a letter to the National Geographic Channel and History Channel and Discovery Channel and so on about the damage these shows do to the archaeological record, but only a few vocal critics have really said much about things on the other side. And I think this is a problem because, as I said, these books are selling way more than ours, right? And these ideas are popular. These shows are getting renewed for season after season, and people that are interested in the past, this is the information they're getting when they seek out information. So, my thought is that if we'd just done the same detective work I walked you through now about that same example, you could build a show on that, right? Talk about the Swedish epigrapher and his interpretation of that. At least I think that's something I would watch. Maybe I'm misguided in that sense. But I like to use this quote, Jonathan Swift: "Reasoning will never make a man correct an ill opinion by which reasoning he never acquired." And this is that statement. It's hard to reason with people that didn't come to their opinions in a logical way. So this brings up the question of what do we do about this? And I think that different kinds of claims and claimants require fundamentally different responses. And I think archaeologists really need to know what are the pseudo-archaeological arguments and claims that are being made in the areas where they work so they can address those directly when they're asked. Because if you're asked about something, your answer is, I don't know anything about that. You're not filling that vacuum in any way. And I think we need to be more proactive about teaching, why these things are problematic. And there's a lot of work in educational psychology that suggests that people can be sort of inoculated against these kinds of pseudoscientific ideas if they're taught critical reasoning skills with those kinds of examples and so on. So there's a lot of reason to believe that we could do more of this. And we need to, archaeology is one of those fields where members of the public make real contributions all the time. They make discoveries, they contribute to research and so on. And the fact that so many people are interested in these ideas means we've got this larger public we're not reaching that could be, a real army that could be harnessed for this. So the question is, should we reach out to the world of people that are interested in this? Should we try to target people that are consuming these ideas and bring them in towards traditional, the scientific archaeological world? It's a difficult question, but I think this is one we have to kind of confront as a field, because right now we're not doing much about this, and these ideas are continuing to proliferate. So with that, I think I'm a little over time, so I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
We were recently up at Petrified Forest National Park or Monument, and we saw a lot of petroglyphs that, to my mind, almost look too good. That the park, is there any program to maybe identify, like, people who come in maybe made graffiti that would look like old and they would erase, like, a graffiti? Is that something that people are thinking about?
I mean, there is graffiti that's happened in recent times in Petrified Forest and other places. A lot of those, the sandstone there is really wonderful for making the patina color differences really different from the surface. And some of those do look fresh, even though they're quite old and fit within this image corpus and so on from things from that area. There are some methods that people have attempted to do to relatively date things, but it's really difficult. And a lot of times it's about context and things like that. But there certainly are, old historic photos of those same places and so on. So those are the kinds of things you can do. And there's been several examples where someone's offered some radical interpretation of some glyph, like that pterosaur. It looks pretty good when you outline it in chalk, but you go back and look at the original photos before the weathering had taken place, it looks nothing like that and so on. So I think that's one way we can address those ideas. But also, we basically need to have, if you're going to make a radical interpretation like that, it can't be like a one-off thing, right? That's kind of part of this. Is these objects and images are part of this larger corpus of imagery. Like a lot of things in the Petrified Forest depict basketry and textile designs and things like that are common in other forms of material culture. So we can kind of look for similarities in that way as well. But dating petroglyphs is difficult. There's people here that probably know a lot more about that than me. But there was a question back there as well.
I was just curious about the guy, whatever his name was, who had that program. He presumably has no credibility. What is his background? How does he end up getting a show like that on?
He writes books that sell. I mean, that's really what it is. He's written this book. He's from Minnesota, and there's this thing called the Kensington runestone there, which is this stone that has these supposed descriptions of a Viking group of people that went all the way to the inland in Minnesota and wrote this document that some believe suggests the eventual dimensions of the United States of America and all these different interpretations. And he's tied to all these ideas about the Templar and so on being the true keepers of the Jesus bloodline and so on. It's very Dan Brown, the way he does this. He writes these books and sells them as nonfiction, and he built up an audience that way. And because he built up an audience that way, he's getting a TV show because he's going after it, right? There are archaeological programs. There's like Time Team America and things like that. These are good shows that are out there, but they're not getting the viewership. They're not getting the attention that things like these more fantastic ideas are, unfortunately. Yeah.
At the beginning of your lecture, you brought up space aliens and religion, and I was thinking of Ezekiel and the wheel. How can you justify what goes on in our society, Judeo-Christian portion of our society? Is this fraud?
How do I justify what goes on in the Judeo-Christian society?
Yeah, how do you accept that as truth, as gospel.
Yeah. Some people do, but I think, like, I'm not here to sort of come down on any specific belief set or anything like that. That's not what I'm talking about. But it's more, if we're making interpretations of things being literal history, literal truth.
But this is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Why should we give them a pass?
This isn't a question we're going to be able to answer here tonight, I don't think. It is, when I teach this class, I have a whole segment on religion and how it sort of intersects with archaeology, because it does intersect in some interesting ways. Archaeology has been used to justify various religious arguments in the past. It's been the Mormon Church in particular has an interest in archaeology because it sort of make arguments about populations from the old world coming over here and establishing various cities and so on. And it's interesting that, and there's things like the Shroud of Turin and so on that have been put to the test by U of A's ASM Archaeology C14 lab here and so on. And those ideas, I think people believe those for different ideas than the evidence, right? We can evaluate the evidence, but that's not necessarily why people came to those beliefs. It's maybe about like what they were raised to believe, how they sort of came up in that religious, household or whatever. What we can do is we can sort of confront when people are sort of taking some of these ideas and using them to justify other sorts of activities. Maybe that's more where you're pushing with that question. That's probably too big a question to address without going into a lot more detail here today. So, yeah.
Just a comment. I had done some work in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
and my cousin said she didn't think the Egyptians were capable of building the pyramids or the Sphinx, and I mentioned it to my Egyptian client, and he laughed and he said, well, if that's true, we Egyptians were clever enough to harvest the talents of these extraterrestrials for us.
Yeah.
Which I thought was kind of a clever response.
There was just the Egyptian pyramids, they are, spectacular, these massive pyramids. There was recently, just last year, a discovery at a quarry where some of the stones that were used for the facing stones for one of the Great Pyramids were there, and there was actually inscriptions written by workers who were working there that wrote poems about the swiftness of their hands in working stone and so on. It's like these amazing things. And it talks about, their pride in their work. And this also confronts other ideas that these were built by skilled workers, not by slaves as is often believed and so on. So there's a lot of things that we can use archaeological evidence to kind of counter these popular ideas that are out there in general about the, true origins of those and so on. Yeah.
Does archaeology have a marketing problem? These people obviously don't. What can archaeologists or archaeology do to better markets? Because you're doing a lot of fascinating work. There's things out there that would make interesting TV, in my opinion, that would marvel anything that these guys do, but yet you guys don't do it.
Yeah, I think, right now there's not like a huge reward system for people that go into doing this kind of popular work, you know what I mean? Like we reward academic publications and those sorts of things, and there's not sort of an equal way of rewarding people that are really engaged in addressing these kinds of ideas or making archaeology public in that way. There's a lot of people that do it well, but it's often directed at the communities that are directly affected by the work that's going on, a lot of public archaeology. I think there needs to be more public archaeology that's directed as just the public writ large as a whole. What can we say about the past? What can we learn about the past by doing that? And I think, there's a ton of fascinating, everyone in this room is here because they, are fascinated by something in the past, right? Some aspect of history and archaeology in the past. And I think there's a whole huge swath of stories that could be told in entertaining ways. We just haven't really gotten there yet. And I think we've kind of been, we're a scientific discipline and we're scientists and we like to stick to those scientific narratives, but I think we also need to be open to having people publicizing this in different sorts of ways that maybe, in 10 years we're going to look at that and say, well, we didn't get that detail quite right, yet maybe we made, 50 new archaeologists by kids that watched that show when they were growing up or so on.
Just better marketing.
Yeah.
There's Petrified Forest was mentioned recently, and there's a story out there that's hard to find, but if you dig, you can find it, that they've purchased land from a ranch up there near, and they found a pueblo that's as big as parts of Chaco Canyon. That would make a great show. How it's being put together, how archaeologists are going in. You can't find anything on it.
I agree. Are you a TV
Obviously, you've heard about this, right?
Yeah.
But the general public hasn't.
Yeah.
But would that make a great show?
Yeah, no, I agree. I definitely think that there is an audience for this, and there's people currently working on this right now, is what I'll say. There's a group of people at the SAAs that have been talking about this for a little while, and I'm hopeful that they'll end up doing something. They're actually thinking of creating a show that's about debunking these kinds of ideas and actually showing the true amazing history of these places and why these pseudoscientific topics, kind of direct us away from the true amazing past. So, yeah.
Is pseudo-archaeology more prevalent here in the United States, and does it manifest itself in different ways in different parts of the world?
It's definitely common all over the world, but it definitely manifests itself differently in different parts of the world. So here, I think, there's a lot of things directed towards North America, like Native American populations didn't build this or that. That's often the way these things are depicted. If you notice, if you look at books like Van Doniken's books and these other books that purportedly have aliens or Atlanteans building things all over the world, notably they're questioning that locals didn't build things in Africa, Asia, North America, South America, not Europe. These are things written in English or French and Dutch and things like that. And they're not necessarily questioning that their own ancestors could have built what they built, but these other people could not. And I think that's there's a very colonial aspect to this, and that has deep roots as well. And it plays out differently in different parts of the world, but definitely I think this is prevalent everywhere. There's definitely a lot of pseudo-archaeology in every corner of the world you look in, is what I would say, unfortunately. Any other questions? Oh, I'm sorry, back there.
Talking about documentaries, I've had some experience with interviews and learned that some of the producers who produce these documentaries that we see are, sometimes they're working on spec, but they have pitched the content of the program to a network or to higher level producers. So that what you see on the screen looks like an interviewer trying to get information from the scientist, but actually he's trying to get something to fit what they had pitched to the producers, who thought this would be a very exciting thing if they could find a scientist to say such and such a thing.
I've done this talk a few places in AAS lectures, and since I've been doing that, I've been getting calls and emails from producers that want me to say what they want them to say on camera, right? They want me to sort of say this or that. And I'm not going to go on camera if I'm not, involved in something beyond this, beyond just sort of saying what they want me to say, reading a script or so on. But that's certainly the case. Is a lot of times they've shot most of the episode before they ever, yeah. They've already got the narrative. So, well, thank you all. I'm happy to talk to anyone else.